The darkest secrets often hide behind the kindest smiles. I learned this truth in the most painful way possible. My name is Dorothy, and I'm 81 years old. I was born in a small town outside Chicago, where the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery mixed with the sound of children playing in tree-lined streets, and where everyone knew each other by name. My white hair tells the story of a long life, filled with joys and sorrows, like that of so many women of my generation. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? I want to tell you a story that marked me deeply. A story about Margaret, my childhood friend, and how untreated pain can transform even the purest soul into something unrecognizable. It's a difficult story to tell, but I believe that sharing it might help someone recognize the signs that I failed to see in time. Margaret and I grew up together like sisters. We were born just 2 months apart, in the summer of 1943, right in the middle of World War II. Our mothers helped each other during those difficult times, sharing the little food they could find and taking care of us in turns. Our houses were so close that as children we could communicate from our bedroom windows using a system of signals we had invented. Margaret had large, dark eyes, always a bit melancholy, even when she smiled. She was an intelligent and sensitive child. She drew beautifully and invented stories that enchanted me. Yet, there was always something restrained about her, as if a part of herself always remained hidden, inaccessible even to me, her best friend. Her family lived in the house next to mine. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect family. Her father, George, was the town pharmacist, a man respected by everyone. Her mother, Mary, was always elegant and composed. But what happened behind those walls was not what it seemed from the outside. I still remember the nights when Margaret would tap on my window, trembling, with the excuse of wanting to look at the stars. Only years later did she confess to me that those nights were the only ones when she could breathe, away from that difficult family situation she experienced daily. Her father showed one face in public and another in private. The respectable pharmacist transformed into a man with an unpredictable temperament behind closed doors. Margaret's mother, an apparently strong woman, but actually fragile as crystal, couldn't protect her from the excessive control they both suffered. "People aren't always what they seem, Dorothy," Margaret often told me, with a wisdom that didn't belong to her age. I didn't fully understand the meaning of those words then. I was fortunate. My parents were simple, my father a carpenter, my mother a seamstress. We didn't have much, but there was love and respect in our house. At school, Margaret was brilliant. The teachers adored her. She was always prepared, precise, diligent. She studied with an intensity that now I understand was her way of escaping the reality of her home. She once confided in me that she dreamed of becoming a nurse, of helping vulnerable people, perhaps because she herself felt vulnerable and no one had ever really helped her. During adolescence, I noticed that Margaret developed an obsession with control. She had to know everything, organize everything. Her notebook was impeccable, her room perfectly ordered. At the time, I thought it was just precision. Now I know it was her way of creating order in the chaos of her life. The years passed. We finished school. I married young to Frank, a gentleman I had known since childhood, and we built a peaceful family with 3 children. Our life was simple but happy. Margaret, instead, studied to become a nurse. She was excellent at her job, meticulous and attentive. The patients adored her. But in her personal life, she seemed attracted to men who reminded her of her father, as if she unconsciously sought to resolve that past she had never truly confronted. When she was 30, Margaret married Dr. Richard, a physician from the hospital where she worked. He was a charming, intelligent man, professionally respected, but with an unpredictable temperament that only those close to him knew. At first it seemed she had found happiness, but soon I noticed the signs: lowered gaze, excuses for occasional bruises, the way she stiffened when he entered the room. that way of constantly checking the clock, terrified at the idea of being late home. I remember one evening in particular. We had been to dinner together, she, Richard, me, and Frank. Margaret had accidentally spilled a glass of wine on the tablecloth. A small accident, nothing serious. But the expression of pure terror on her face is something I'll never forget. I'm so sorry, she kept repeating, trembling as she cleaned. Richard smiled, saying it was nothing, but his eyes told another story. Later, when we were alone for a moment, I tried to talk to her. Margaret, is everything all right? You seem scared. She looked at me with empty eyes. I'm just so distracted lately. Richard is right to be frustrated with me. Nobody should make you feel this way over a spilled glass, I said cautiously. You don't understand, she replied quickly. He does so much for me. He works hard. He deserves to come home and find everything perfect. The same excuses her mother made for her father years before. She confided in me about her moments of desperation, about how she felt trapped, but she always refused my help. It's just a difficult period, she repeated. Richard is going through a lot of stress at work. I tried to convince her to leave him, to come stay with me for a while, but she always refused. Things aren't that simple, Dorothy. I can't leave him. He loves me in his own way. It was during that period, after about 5 years of marriage, that Margaret had the idea of opening a nursing home. She invited me for coffee, and her eyes shone with an energy I hadn't seen for a long time. I want to take care of vulnerable people, she told me with eyes suddenly illuminated by an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in a long time. I want to create a place where elderly people feel safe, respected, loved, a place I never had. It was the first time she openly admitted she had never felt safe. What does Richard think? I asked cautiously. Surprisingly, he agrees, she replied. He says it's a good investment. He even offered to help me with the medical side. The Peaceful Haven opened in an old renovated villa on the outskirts of the city, about 8 months later. It was an elegant building surrounded by a lush garden with a view that stretched across the Illinois countryside. It seemed like the perfect place to spend the final years of one's life. Margaret had taken care of every detail, from coordinated curtains to comfortable furniture, from paintings to plants that adorned every room. She had hired qualified staff and seemed determined to create a truly welcoming environment. Initially, everything went wonderfully. Margaret seemed to have found her calling. She dedicated herself body and soul to her guests, knew their stories, their medications, their preferences. She spent hours listening to tales of their youth, looking at yellowed photographs of their children and grandchildren. Richard, surprisingly, supported her in this project, perhaps because the nursing home soon began generating good income. Finally, I have a purpose, Dorothy, she told me one afternoon while we had coffee in the facility's garden. Here I'm the one who decides. I'm the one in control. Nobody can tell me what to do. These elderly people trust me, respect me. Do you know how important that is to me? Those words struck me. It wasn't just compassion guiding her, but the need for control. However, I dismissed that thought, happy to see her finally fulfilled in something. And indeed, the elderly adored her. They called her our angel, and she smiled with an expression that finally seemed peaceful. I visited Peaceful Haven often. I had grown fond to many of the residents. There was Walter, a former history teacher with an extraordinary memory who told stories about the Depression as if it were yesterday. Frank, not my husband, but an elderly widower who cultivated roses in the small space that Margaret had reserved for him in the garden. And then there was Helen, a woman who had lost her husband and 2 sons in a car accident years before, and who considered Margaret like the daughter she never had. It was about a year after the opening that I began to notice strange changes. The residents of the nursing home seemed to rotate with unusual frequency. When I asked about some elderly people I hadn't seen for a while, Margaret always had a ready explanation. transferred, returned to families, someone unfortunately deceased from natural causes. It's normal, she explained with a serene smile. At their age, unfortunately, that's how life goes. But there was something in her eyes that troubled me. That same look she had as a child when she was hiding something. And then there were those moments when I caught her staring into space, with an expression I couldn't decipher. Richard's behavior had also changed. He came to the nursing home more often, was interested in the finances, spent hours in Margaret's office checking documents. Once I heard him arguing animatedly with her. We need to maximize profits, Margaret. These people are already paying a fortune to stay here. We should at least make sure it's worth it. One day, while I was bringing flowers for Helen, a sweet woman who reminded me of my grandmother, Margaret greeted me with a tense expression. "I'm sorry you came for nothing," she said, taking the flowers from my hands. "Helen was sick during the night. We had to transfer her urgently to the hospital." "Oh, poor Helen. Which hospital? I'd like to go visit her." Margaret hesitated, just for an instant. "Chicago General." "But you know how they are in these cases. They don't allow visits from anyone but close family." I nodded, but that evening I called Chicago General. No Helen had been admitted in the last 48 hours. It was at that moment that a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. What was really happening at Peaceful Haven? And why was Margaret, the sweet child with whom I had shared the secrets of childhood, lying to me? I couldn't imagine that what I would discover in the following months would forever change not only my life, but also that of many families who had entrusted their loved ones to the care of my childhood friend. But what I discovered after changed everything. After that phone call to the hospital, I couldn't sleep for days. Memories of my childhood with Margaret mixed with disturbing images of elderly people mysteriously disappearing. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I had called the wrong hospital. Maybe Helen was registered under another name for some reason. Maybe Margaret had simply confused the details. But deep in my heart, I knew there was something darker. I decided to investigate discreetly. The next day, I returned to Peaceful Haven with the excuse of bringing homemade cookies for the residents. Margaret seemed nervous, but welcomed me with her usual smile. "What a surprise, Dorothy. I wasn't expecting you today." "I was passing by and thought I'd visit. How is Helen? Any news from the hospital?" Margaret lowered her gaze. "Unfortunately, no. Her situation is complicated. The doctors are doing what they can." "Which ward? I could bring her something." "Intensive care," she replied too quickly. "No visits allowed, I told you." While we talked, I noticed Richard watching us from Margaret's office. He nodded hello, but didn't approach. There was something cold in his eyes that made me shiver. I asked to greet some of the other residents I knew. Margaret hesitated, but then agreed, personally accompanying me from room to room. I noticed that some rooms that were previously occupied were now empty. "We've had several transfers recently," explained Margaret, intercepting my gaze. "Families who decided to take care of their loved ones personally. It's a good thing, isn't it?" While we talked with Frank, the elderly man who loved roses, I noticed he seemed confused, almost sedated. His eyes, usually lively, were dull. When Margaret moved away for a moment, I approached him. "Frank, do you feel well?" He looked at me with difficulty. "The medicines. Too many medicines. I can't think clearly." Before I could ask him anything else, Margaret returned, and the conversation was interrupted. Leaving the facility, I decided to pass by the back garden, the one where Frank cultivated his roses. It was there that I noticed something strange. An area of the garden seemed to have been recently dug up and covered over. The plants had been moved and replaced in a way that tried to look natural, but not to the eyes of someone who knew that garden well. That night, childhood memories of Margaret returned to torment me. I remembered episodes I had forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to see. Margaret was 10 years old when I found her crying behind the school. At first she didn't want to talk, but eventually she showed me bruises on her arms. "I fell," she said, but her eyes told another story. When I insisted, she confided that her father had grabbed her forcefully because she had gotten a lower grade than usual in math. "But don't tell anyone, Dorothy," she begged me. "Dad says no one would believe a child. Everyone thinks he's a respectable man." I also remembered that time when we were 15, when her mother had an accident in the kitchen. She broke her arm falling down the stairs. That was the official version. But Margaret whispered to me, with eyes full of fear, "It wasn't a fall. I heard them fighting. He pushed her." And then there was that strange obsession of Margaret's with control, which became more evident during adolescence. The way she meticulously organized her notebooks, as if ordering external things could somehow compensate for the chaos of her family life. At university, Margaret excelled in nursing studies. She was brilliant, precise, methodical, but even then, her relationships with men followed a worrying pattern. She was attracted to dominant personalities, to men who made decisions for her, who controlled her in subtle ways. Richard was the culmination of this pattern, a respected doctor, intelligent, charming in public. The first time she introduced him to me, there was an adoration in her eyes that troubled me. She looked at him as if he were a god, not a man. Their wedding was sumptuous, paid for entirely by Margaret's father. A superficial reconciliation, I thought at the time. Now I wonder if it wasn't another way to maintain appearances. The first signs of Richard's control were subtle. He decided where to go to dinner. He chose Margaret's clothes. He controlled her friendships. "Richard thinks I should concentrate on my career rather than going out too much," Margaret told me when she refused my invitations. Then the frequent phone calls began when we were together. He always had to know where she was, with whom, doing what. I remember once she arrived half an hour late to one of our coffee appointments. She was pale, trembling. "I was delayed at work," she said. "Richard was worried." It was about 3 years after their marriage that I noticed the first bruise, on her wrist, almost hidden by a bracelet. When I pointed it out, she laughed nervously. "I'm so clumsy lately." But her eyes avoided mine. The bruises became more frequent, always with the same excuse. She had fallen, bumped into something, was clumsy. The same excuses she had used as a child. One evening, about 5 years after their marriage, Margaret arrived at my house in tears. She had a cut on her lip and a swollen eye. "I can't live like this anymore," she sobbed. "I'm scared, Dorothy. I'm really scared." I convinced her to stay at my house that night. I prepared the couch for her, gave her a clean nightgown. But in the morning, when I woke up, she was already gone. She had left a note. "I'm sorry. I can't. He loves me in his own way." It was shortly after that Margaret had the idea of the nursing home. Now I understand she was desperately seeking a way to escape Richard's control, to create a space entirely her own, a place where she was the one with power. At first, Richard firmly opposed it. "Why do you want to complicate your life?" he asked her in front of me during a dinner. "You already have a good job at the hospital." But then something changed. Suddenly, Richard became enthusiastic about the idea. "Actually, it could be an excellent investment," he said. "These places make fortunes with rich families who want to place their elderly." It was he who found the villa, he who took care of the documents, he who negotiated with the bank for the loan. And strangely, he seemed to loosen his control over Margaret, or at least, that's how it seemed to me. Peaceful Haven quickly became a success. Families lined up to place their elderly in that elegant facility, with caring staff and a director so attentive to details. Margaret seemed finally happy, fulfilled. She spent hours with the elderly, listened to their stories, personally took care of their needs. But there was something in her eyes, a shadow I couldn't decipher. Sometimes I caught her looking into space with an expression that reminded me of her mother. Richard became an increasingly constant presence in the facility. He didn't take care of the residents. That was Margaret and the staff's job. But he spent a lot of time in the office, checking the account books, talking with families of new residents, negotiating rates. He's become so passionate about the project, Margaret told me once. He says we could open others in the future. It was about a year after the opening that I began to notice the first oddities. The residents seemed to change with unusual frequency. When I asked about someone I hadn't seen for a while, Margaret always had a ready explanation. Transferred, returned to family, deceased from natural causes. It's normal in these places, she told me with a sad smile. Elderly people's lives are fragile. But then I began to notice other things. The staff seemed to change often. The nurses Margaret had hired at the beginning, experienced professionals I knew from the hospital, were gradually replaced by young girls, inexperienced, who seemed intimidated by Margaret and Richard. And there were the medicines. One day, entering Margaret's office to look for her, I noticed an open cabinet full of drugs. I wasn't a nurse, but I recognized some names: powerful sedatives, heart medications, strong painkillers. Many more than seemed necessary for a nursing home of that size. When I asked for explanations, Margaret quickly closed the cabinet. "We must be prepared for any eventuality," she said. "Richard insists we always have adequate supplies." It was after Helen's mysterious disappearance that I decided to investigate more deeply. I began visiting Peaceful Haven at different times, sometimes without warning. I noticed that some rooms were quickly reassigned after a resident's departure. Names on doors changed, personal photographs were removed, every trace of the previous occupant erased. One evening, after visiting hours, I returned to the facility with the excuse of having forgotten my purse. The parking lot was almost empty, only Margaret's and Richard's cars. I entered through the back door, the one leading to the laundry, which I knew was often left open for deliveries. The facility was silent, disturbingly silent for a place that housed about 20 elderly people. I moved cautiously down the corridor, trying not to make noise. I heard voices coming from Margaret's office. I approached, staying hidden in the shadows. "We need to be more careful," Richard was saying. "That old friend of yours is asking too many questions." "Dorothy doesn't suspect anything," replied Margaret, but her voice trembled slightly. "She trusts me." "We can't take risks. We have a good thing here. Think about how much money we've already saved. Another year or two and we can move abroad. Forget all this." "And the residents?" asked Margaret, with a voice I didn't recognize. "What residents?" Richard laughed. "The ones who continue to pay even after they've left? Or the ones who are still here? Don't worry, my dear. Nobody will miss them. They've already been forgotten by their families." I heard a noise behind me and quickly hid in an empty room. A young nurse passed in the corridor with a tray of medicines. I waited for her to move away and then headed toward the exit, my heart beating wildly. That night I didn't sleep. Richard's words kept echoing in my mind. The ones who continue to pay even after they've left? What did that mean? And why would families continue paying for people who were no longer in the facility? The next day, I made a decision. I had to find out what was really happening at Peaceful Haven. I had to know, for Helen, for Frank, for all those vulnerable elderly who had been entrusted to the care of my childhood friend. I couldn't imagine that the truth would be much more terrible than I had ever suspected, and that it would reveal a side of Margaret I would never have believed possible. Her words from so many years ago now resonated with new and terrifying meaning. People aren't always what they seem, Dorothy. And indeed, when I opened that locked door at the end of the corridor, what I saw froze the blood in my veins. The image of that locked door at the end of the corridor continued to torment me. I hadn't opened it that night. The sound of footsteps had forced me to flee. But I knew I had to return. I had to discover what Peaceful Haven was hiding behind that facade of loving care. In the following days, I began gathering information with greater determination. I spoke with some residents' families, pretending to be interested in placing my mother in the facility. Their responses were surprisingly similar. "We receive regular updates from the director," one resident's daughter told me. "But visits are limited. Health problems of the elderly," she says. "They don't want to expose them to too many external contacts." "When did you last see your father?" I asked cautiously. The woman seemed uncomfortable. "A month ago, maybe 2. Doctor, Richard says Dad is in a delicate phase. But he's improving, they assure me." This pattern repeated in all the conversations. Families paying considerable sums, but seeing their loved ones less and less frequently. Always the same excuse: delicate health conditions, need to limit visits, doctors who knew better. One morning, I decided to follow one of the younger nurses, Carol, who seemed particularly nervous every time I met her. I saw her leave Peaceful Haven after her shift and reached her at the bar where she had stopped for coffee. "Excuse me," I said, sitting at her table. "You work at Peaceful Haven, right? I'm a friend of the director." Carol visibly paled. "Yes, but I'm about to leave. I gave my resignation yesterday." "May I ask why?" She looked around as if she feared being watched. "I can't talk about it. I signed a confidentiality agreement." "It's about the residents, isn't it? About what happens to them." Her hands trembled as she gripped the coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about. Excuse me, I have to go." But as she got up, she whispered, "Check the medicine records. Dr. Richard keeps a separate register in his office." That same evening, I returned to Peaceful Haven. It was dinner time, and I knew Margaret would be busy with the residents in the common room. Richard, instead, was at the hospital for a night shift. I knew this because Margaret had mentioned it to me the day before. I entered through the same back door and headed directly to Richard's office. It was locked, but I knew Margaret well enough to know where she kept spare keys, in a vase in the corridor, hidden among artificial flowers. The office was meticulously organized. Shelves of medical files, a computer turned off, an immaculate desk. I headed toward the metal cabinet in a corner. That too was locked, but the key was in the first drawer of the desk, under some documents. Inside the cabinet I found several registers. One official, with regular prescriptions for residents, light painkillers, blood pressure medications, vitamins. But there was also a second register, thinner, hidden behind some folders. I opened it with trembling hands. What I read left me breathless. Dosages of sedatives much higher than was safe. Dangerous combinations of drugs that I knew to be harmful. And next to some names, a small red cross and a date. I compared those dates with the list of residents who had transferred or died from natural causes. They matched perfectly. I was rapidly taking notes on those pages when I heard a noise at the door. I quickly put the register back in its place, closed the cabinet, and hid behind a curtain just as the door opened. It was Margaret. She entered the office and headed toward the cabinet, opening the same folder I had just consulted. I watched as she added something, her hand trembling slightly. Then she sighed deeply, passed a hand over her face and left, closing the door behind her. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding place. I returned to the cabinet and checked Margaret's update. A new name had been added to the list: Frank, the elderly man who loved roses. Next to his name, the same red cross and that day's date. My heart stopped. Frank, who just 2 weeks before had shown me with pride his new roses. Frank, who always told me about the granddaughter who came to visit him on Sundays. Frank, who had told me he felt strange because of the too many medicines. I left the office with nausea rising in my throat. I had to see Frank, had to make sure he was okay. I headed toward his room, trying to maintain calm. The door was ajar. I entered cautiously. Frank was in his bed, apparently asleep. I approached, calling his name softly. There was no response. "Frank?" I called, a little louder, touching his hand. It was cold. Too cold. At that moment, Margaret appeared at the door. "Dorothy! What are you doing here at this hour?" "Frank," I whispered. "What happened to him?" Margaret entered the room and closed the door behind her. "A heart attack, unfortunately. It happened this afternoon." "We were waiting for the coroner for the formal procedures." "But didn't you call an ambulance? Didn't you try to save him?" "Of course we did," she replied, but avoided my gaze. But it was too late. At his age, these events are sudden. "And why didn't you tell me? You knew I was fond of him." "It all happened so fast, Dorothy. And then, you're not a family member." There was something cold in her voice, something I didn't recognize. I looked at Frank, his serene expression, as if he had fallen asleep. But I knew what I had seen in the register. "Margaret," I said slowly, "what's really happening here?" "I don't understand what you mean," she replied, but her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "Why do so many residents die or get transferred? Why can't families visit their loved ones regularly? What's in that special register in Richard's office?" Her face changed. The mask of compassion slipped away, revealing something hard, unrecognizable. "You're snooping where you shouldn't, Dorothy. It's not wise." "I'm asking questions someone should be asking," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to Helen? And to all the others? What are you and Richard doing?" Margaret approached, her voice now a tense whisper. "You don't understand. You could never understand." "Then explain it to me. We've been friends forever, Margaret." "Whatever it is, we can solve it together." For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Margaret in her eyes, vulnerable, scared. But it quickly disappeared. "Some people are destined to suffer, Dorothy. I understood that long ago. My father taught me that. Richard reminded me of it. Life is suffering, and then it ends. I'm just speeding up the process for those already condemned to slow agony." Her words froze my blood. "Are you saying you're helping them die? Without their consent?" "Do you call this living?" she said, indicating Frank's body. "Abandoned by families, left to rot in a room with constant pain and lost dignity? I offer them a peaceful way out, and meanwhile, you continue to collect payments from families," I concluded, feeling sick. Margaret didn't deny it. "Money is freedom, Dorothy. Something I've never had. With enough money, I'll finally be able to escape Richard, start a new life far from here." "Richard? But I thought he was your accomplice in all this." She laughed bitterly. "Richard isn't my accomplice. He's my jailer. He discovered what I was doing, and instead of reporting me, he decided to exploit the situation. He doubled the departures, began contacting families himself, inventing stories about their loved ones. He holds me in his grip with the threat of revealing everything." "But why, Margaret? Why did you start all this?" She approached the window, looking out into the night. "Because I could. Because it was in my power to decide. All my life I've been controlled. By my father, by Richard. This was my chance to have control, to decide who lives and who dies." I looked at her, this woman I had known all my life, and saw a stranger. "It's not too late to stop all this," I said. "We can ask for help. We can explain that Richard forced you." "Nobody forced me to do anything," she interrupted abruptly. "This was my choice, the only real choice I've ever made. And now you, my dearest friend, want to take it away from me." At that moment, the door opened and Richard entered. He looked at both of us, his expression calm, but his eyes cold and calculating. "What a nice reunion," he said. "Dorothy, what a surprise to find you here so late." "I was just leaving," I replied, trying to seem calm. "After hearing so many interesting things?" I don't think so. I looked at Margaret, silently pleading with my eyes, but she turned away. Margaret just told me a very interesting story, said Richard, approaching. Apparently, her dear childhood friend has been snooping in my office. She's seen things she shouldn't have seen. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied. The security system, Dorothy, he smiled, pointing to a small camera in the corner of the room. Modern technology. Very useful. I felt trapped. I looked toward the door, calculating my chances of escape. Don't do anything stupid, said Richard, almost reading my thoughts. We have a problem to solve, the three of us, and I think we'll have to find a permanent solution. At that moment, Margaret seemed to wake up from a nightmare. No, Richard, not her. She's my childhood friend. She's a risk we can't afford, he replied calmly. She's seen too much. She knows too much. Oh, please, Margaret begged. And for a moment I saw again the scared child who knocked on my window at night. There has to be another way. Richard sighed, as if he were talking to a stubborn child. You know there isn't, my dear. But don't worry, I'll take care of it. You go prepare the medicines for Mrs. Dorothy. Something delicate, that leaves no traces. As Margaret left the room, with hunched shoulders and lowered head, Richard turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know, Dorothy, in a way I'm sorry. From what Margaret told me, you were a good friend, but business is business, and we can't afford sentimentality. You're killing innocent people, I said, trying to buy time. People who trust you. I prefer to see it as a service, he replied, sitting comfortably in the chair next to Frank's bed. These people have already been abandoned by their families. We offer them a dignified end without pain. And meanwhile, their families can live with the comforting conviction that their loved ones are being cared for. Everyone wins. It's monstrous, I whispered. It's business, he corrected. And then, who can say it's wrong? Margaret started all this on her own, you know, before I discovered it. My sweet wife has a dark side I never even suspected. I think it's the result of that traumatic childhood she's always talking about. Or maybe it's just her true nature finally emerging. At that moment, Margaret re-entered the room with a glass of water and a small white pill. Her hands were shaking. Here, said Richard, taking the glass and the pill. A simple and painless method, just like we do with our most expensive guests. I looked at Margaret, desperately seeking a sign of my friend in those empty eyes. Margaret, don't do it. You're not like him. I know you're not. For a long moment, Margaret remained motionless, her gaze fixed on me. Then, with a sudden movement, she struck the glass in Richard's hand, making it fall. No, she said, her voice suddenly firm. Not her, not Dorothy. Richard looked at her with cold fury. You're making a mistake, Margaret. I've already made too many, she replied. This one I won't make. What happened next is still confused in my memories. Richard moved toward Margaret with a rage he no longer tried to hide. I grabbed the first thing I found, a vase from Frank's nightstand, and hit him with all the strength I had. Richard collapsed to the ground, stunned but not unconscious. I grabbed Margaret by the arm. We have to get out of here, now. But she didn't move. I can't, Dorothy. I can't run from what I've done. Then we'll do the right thing, I insisted. Together. At that moment, we heard voices in the corridor. Someone had heard the noise of the scuffle. One of the night nurses opened the door and looked at the scene with wide eyes. Richard on the ground, Margaret and I standing, Frank's body still in the bed. Call the police, Margaret told her, with a calm I had never heard in her voice before. Tell them there's been an accident. Many accidents. When the police arrived, Margaret was sitting on the edge of Frank's bed, holding his hand as if she could still feel hers. She wasn't crying, wasn't shaking anymore. She seemed almost relieved. Her first words to the inspector who entered the room were, "My name is Margaret, and I've done terrible things. But now I want to tell you everything." And as they took her away, she turned to me only once. In her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, but a strange, calm acceptance. I couldn't imagine that that night would mark the beginning of one of the most shocking investigations in the history of our state. Or that Margaret's revelations would bring to light not only the crimes of Peaceful Haven, but also deeper and more disturbing truths about human nature and how untreated pain can transform into something monstrous. But as I watched my childhood friend being led away in handcuffs, one question continued to torment me. Was it too late for Margaret? Could there be redemption for someone who had caused so much pain? And I, who had seen the signs for years without ever truly intervening, wasn't I partly responsible? The answers to these questions would come only much later, when I finally decided to visit Margaret in prison. The days that followed Margaret and Richard's arrest were a whirlwind of interrogations, statements, and newspaper headlines. The news of the House of Horrors, as the media quickly called it, shook the entire region. Desperate families showed up at the police station, seeking information about their loved ones they hadn't seen for months or even years. The police transformed Peaceful Haven into a crime scene. The garden, that same garden where Frank cultivated his roses, was meticulously excavated. What they found confirmed our worst fears: human remains, not of 1 or 2 bodies, but of 9 elderly people. They asked me to identify some of the victims through photographs and personal objects. I recognized Helen by her necklace with a small cameo she always wore. I recognized Walter by his distinctive horn-rimmed glasses. Each identification was like a dagger to the heart. "How could you not notice anything?" a young inspector asked me during one of the interrogations. "You were the intimate friend of Mrs. Margaret your whole life." The question haunted me. How could I not have seen? Or perhaps, more honestly, how could I have chosen not to see? The signs had been there from the beginning. Margaret's obsession with control, her need for power, her history of abuse never truly addressed. "Sometimes," I replied slowly, "it's easier to believe the lies of someone we love rather than face a terrible truth." The inspector looked at me with a mixture of compassion and skepticism. "Mrs. Margaret has asked to see you," he said finally. "She said she'll only talk to you." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to flee, forget everything, pretend that Margaret, my childhood friend, hadn't become a monster. But another part needed answers, needed to understand how we had arrived at this point. The prison was a gray and oppressive building on the outskirts of the city. They led me through austere corridors to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Margaret was already there, seated, wearing a gray prison uniform that made her seem even smaller and more fragile. When she saw me, her eyes lit up for an instant, then lowered, unable to sustain my gaze. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I sat across from her, separated by the table that suddenly seemed enormous. "Why did you ask to see me, Margaret?" "Because you're the only one who could understand," she replied. "The only one who knows where I come from, where it all began." "I'm not sure I can understand you," I admitted. "What you did is unforgivable," she completed. "I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dorothy. I'm asking you to listen. And then, if you want, you can turn your back on me forever." And so Margaret began to talk. She told me everything, without filters, without excuses, how she had started helping some particularly suffering residents to find peace. At first, she said, they were only terminal ones, those suffering hopelessly. Small doses of morphine, nothing that could arouse suspicion. "I told myself it was compassion," she explained, her hands twisting on the table. "But the truth is, I felt powerful. For the first time in my life, I decided. Not my father. Not Richard. Me. Then Richard had discovered everything. But instead of reporting her, he had seen an opportunity. Why stop at terminal residence? Why not speed up, even for those who had families that paid well but visited little? Richard always had an eye for business, Margaret said with a bitter laugh. He transformed my personal madness into an enterprise. He began keeping records, selecting residents based on their finances and the frequency of family visits. Those who paid more but were visited less were first on the list. She told me how they falsified papers, transfer certificates, discharge documents, occasionally death certificates for natural causes when the family insisted on a funeral. Richard, with his hospital connections, managed to arrange everything. "And you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did you continue?" Margaret raised her gaze, and in her eyes I saw a pain so deep it almost made me forget her crimes. Almost. At first, out of fear, Richard threatened to report me, to make it seem like it was all my doing. Then, I don't know, Dorothy. It's like I slipped into an abyss so deep I couldn't see the light anymore. Every day it became easier. Every death became more insignificant. She stopped, breathing deeply. Until Frank. Until I saw you, standing in his room, looking at me like I was a monster. And I realized that's exactly what I had become. "Why did you spare me?" I asked. "That night, why did you stop Richard?" A sad smile crossed her face. "Because you're the only pure thing in my life, Dorothy. The only one I never wanted to hurt. Do you remember when I knocked on your window as a child? Those nights were the only ones when I felt safe. When I felt loved." Tears streamed down her face now, but she made no effort to dry them. "That night, when Richard wanted to hurt you, something broke inside me. I saw clearly what I had become. And I understood I couldn't fall any lower." While she spoke, a nurse entered the room with a small cup of pills. Margaret took them without protest. "For anxiety," she explained, noticing my gaze. "The irony doesn't escape you, does it? Now I'm the one taking the medicines." After the nurse left, Margaret continued, telling me about her first days in prison, her complete breakdown when the reality of what she had done hit her fully. "The prosecutor says I'll cooperate by testifying against Richard," she said. "But the truth is, we're both guilty. I started all this. I opened that door." "And the families?" I asked. "What did you feel when you saw the families of the people you—" "At first, nothing," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I saw them as accomplices. People who had abandoned their elderly, who visited them less and less frequently. I told myself deep down they didn't really care." "But that wasn't true," I said. "No," she whispered, "it wasn't true. I understood that when I saw Helen's daughter at the preliminary hearing, the devastation in her eyes. She said she visited rarely because each visit destroyed her. Seeing her mother decline broke her heart, but she loved her. God, how she loved her." Silence fell between us, a heavy silence, laden with pain and unspoken truths. "Have you talked to a psychiatrist?" I asked finally. Margaret nodded. "Every day. He says the trauma of my childhood, the abuse, the marriage with Richard, contributed, but don't justify. Nothing could justify." "And what do you think?" She looked me in the eyes for the first time. "I think inside each of us, there's a darkness that's just waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. Mine emerged when I had power over vulnerable people. Maybe my father's darkness emerged the same way, when he had power over my mother and me." "But you stopped Richard," I reminded her. "In the end, you chose to do the right thing." "Too late," she said bitterly. "Too late for Helen, for Frank, for all the others." Before I could respond, A guard entered to warn us our time was almost up. Margaret suddenly seemed anxious. "Dorothy, there's something else I have to tell you. Something I haven't told the police." "What?" I asked, feeling a shiver of worry. Richard had plans to expand. Other nursing homes, in other cities, and he wasn't alone. There were other doctors, other administrators involved. "Who?" I asked, incredulous. "I don't know all the names, but Richard kept a separate register, hidden, not in his office at Peaceful Haven, but at our house, in his study, behind the portrait of his father. A safe. Have you told the police this?" "I'm scared," she admitted. "These people are powerful, Dorothy, and I'll be here inside, defenseless, for a long time." I understood her fear. If what she said was true, Richard was only the tip of the iceberg of something much larger and more sinister. "I'll tell the police," I promised, "but they've already searched your house, surely." "Not in the right way," Margaret insisted. "They don't know what to look for, or where." The guard warned us that time was up. I got up, looking at this woman who had once known better than myself and who now seemed like a stranger. "Margaret," I said, hesitating, "do you think you'll ever be able to forgive yourself?" A sad smile touched her lips. "It's not a question of forgiveness, Dorothy. It's a question of responsibility, of living every day with the awareness of what I've done and trying, somehow, to make amends, even if I know it's impossible." As I walked away, she suddenly stood up. "Dorothy, one more thing." I turned. "Tell the families. Tell them that in the end, their loved ones didn't suffer. It's not much, I know, but it's the truth." I left the prison with a weight on my heart that I knew would never leave me. But I also had a mission. Find that register and make sure justice didn't stop at Margaret and Richard. That same evening, I contacted the inspector following the case. Initially skeptical, he agreed to organize a new search of Margaret and Richard's house, focusing on the study and the portrait Margaret had mentioned. They found the safe exactly where Margaret had said. And inside, a detailed register that confirmed her words. Names of doctors, administrators of other nursing homes, meeting dates, sums of money. An entire network of people who transformed elderly suffering into profit. In the following days, arrests multiplied. The press now spoke of a national scandal involving facilities in 3 different regions. Health authorities initiated comprehensive inspections of all nursing homes in the country. A week after my visit to Margaret, the inspector summoned me to the station. He showed me a letter Margaret had written for me, but which the police had intercepted. "You can read it," he said, "but we'd like to keep it as evidence. It contains information that could be useful to the case." The letter was long, written in the neat handwriting I knew so well. It began with a memory from our childhood, when we sat under an old oak tree and I told her stories I made up on the spot. It continued describing the exact moment when she had administered the first lethal dose to an elderly man. Not out of compassion, as she had told herself, but out of curiosity, to see if she could do it, if she could make that final decision about someone's life. "It was like a dam had burst inside me," she wrote. "All the anger, all the pain I had repressed for years exploded in that single act. I felt powerful, Dorothy. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the victim." She described how that sensation of power had become an addiction, how each subsequent death became easier, almost banal, how Richard, discovering what she did, instead of stopping her, had pushed her even further, transforming her personal disorder into a business. "But while Richard saw only money," she continued, "I kept seeking that sensation, that absolute control I had never had over my own life." The letter concluded with something that made me hold my breath. "The doctor here says I'm beginning to understand the origin of my behavior. He says untreated trauma can transform into something monstrous if left to fester. I think he's right. But there's something else, something I haven't told anyone except you. Sometimes, in the darkest moments of night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder if maybe it wasn't also a distorted form of revenge. Revenge against my father, whom I could never confront. Revenge against Richard, who controlled me in more subtle but equally devastating ways. Revenge against a world that allowed all this to happen. The innocent victims paid for guilt that wasn't theirs. And this is the heaviest weight I carry, Dorothy. A weight that won't disappear even if I lived 1,000 lives. I folded the letter with trembling hands and returned it to the inspector. "What do you think?" he asked me. "I think," I replied slowly, "that the most terrifying evil isn't that of fairy tale monsters, but that which is born from untreated human pain. I think Margaret is responsible for her actions, but also victim of a system that didn't know how to protect her when she was vulnerable." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "You might be interested to know that Mrs. Margaret has asked to speak with a forensic psychiatrist. She wants to understand. She says she can't change the past, but maybe she can help prevent others from following the same path." As I left the police station, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and blood red. I thought of Margaret, of the scared child who knocked on my window, of the tormented woman who had transformed her pain into something monstrous, of the prisoner who now desperately sought to understand her own abyss. And I wondered if there could really be redemption for her. If somewhere in the depths of that darkness there was still a glimmer of the Margaret I once knew and loved. And if that glimmer, however faint, could one day grow enough to illuminate the path toward a form of peace. Not forgiveness, that seemed impossible, but understanding. The answer, I discovered, would come years later, in a way I never could have imagined. More than 45 years have passed since that evening at the police station. Almost half a century since the House of Horrors case shocked the entire nation. Decades since I last saw my childhood friend Margaret taken away in handcuffs, with empty eyes and shoulders bent under the weight of her actions. The trial was long and painful. The media pounced on the story like vultures, digging into the most macabre details, transforming Margaret into a monster, a symbol of evil. The Angel of Death, they called her. The victims' families demanded justice, revenge, the harshest possible sentence. Richard, with his cunning and connections, tried to shift all blame onto Margaret. He painted her as a mentally unstable woman, obsessed with power over life and death. He claimed to have discovered everything only a few days before the arrest and to have planned to report her. But the register found in the safe told another story. It revealed not only his involvement, but also that of 12 other doctors and administrators of nursing homes in 3 different regions, an entire network that transformed elderly vulnerability into profit. In the end, Richard was sentenced to 30 years in prison, Margaret to 25, with recommendation for continuous psychiatric support. The others involved received varying sentences based on their role in the network. For years, I couldn't visit Margaret in prison. The pain was too great, the betrayal too deep. I occasionally received her letters I sometimes read and others left closed in the drawer. Letters that spoke of her therapy journey, her slow and painful understanding of what she had done and why. "Dr. Wilson says I'm making progress," she wrote in one of these. "But every progress brings with it a new level of awareness, and with it a new level of pain. The more I understand, the more I suffer for what I've done." In another letter, she told me how her psychiatrist had encouraged her to use her experience to help others. He asked me to speak with young psychologists and social workers, to explain to them how to recognize signs of untreated trauma, how to identify potential abusers before it's too late. At first, I thought it was cruel. Who would want to listen to a woman like me? But then I understood. If my story can save even one person from the abyss I fell into, then maybe there's meaning in all this pain. And so, while Margaret served her sentence, she also began a different journey. She collaborated with researchers studying the psychology of abuse in care facilities. She helped develop protocols to identify warning signs. Her story, however terrible, became a case study to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Meanwhile, I tried to rebuild my life. The case had marked me deeply. How could I not have seen? How could I have ignored the signs? These questions tormented me. I decided to channel that sense of guilt into something constructive. Together with some victims' families, we founded an association, Never Alone Again. Our goal was to improve conditions in nursing homes, train staff to recognize signs of abuse, help families stay connected with their elderly, even when physical or emotional distance seemed insurmountable. It was through this work that I met Patricia, Helen's daughter. At first, our relationship was tense. How could it not be? I had been friends with the one who killed her mother, but over time, shared pain created a bond between us. "You know what torments me most?" Patricia told me one day. "It's not just that my mother died. It's that she died believing I had abandoned her, that I didn't care enough to visit her regularly." Her words struck my heart. How many other elderly died every day with this same thought, even without someone like Margaret's intervention? Our association grew. We collaborated with the Department of Health to develop new regulations for nursing homes. We organized training for healthcare personnel. We created programs to connect elderly and young people, to build bridges between generations. And slowly, I began to feel that maybe, somehow, I was making amends for not having seen, for not having acted before. It was 10 years after Margaret's arrest that I received an unexpected phone call from the prison. It was the director. "Mrs. Dorothy," he said gravely, "inmate Margaret has specifically asked to see you. She's not in good health conditions. The doctors aren't optimistic. Cancer. It started in the breast and then spread rapidly. They gave her a few months. I don't know what drove me to go after all those years of silence. Maybe a sense of duty toward that child who once knocked on my window. Maybe the awareness that everyone deserves a last moment of human connection, even those who have done terrible things. The prison had changed little in those 10 years. But Margaret was unrecognizable. Her once dark hair was now completely white and thin. Her face gaunt, her eyes sunken. Yet, when she saw me, those eyes lit up with a light I remembered from childhood. "You came," she whispered, her voice weak but full of wonder. "You really came." I sat next to her bed in the prison infirmary. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. What do you say to someone who has been everything to you and then became a stranger? To someone you loved and then feared? To someone who was victim and executioner? "Your letters," I said finally. "I read them all." A weak smile crossed her face. "Even when you didn't answer, I knew you would read them. I know you, Dorothy." "You knew me," I corrected gently. "I've changed." "We all change," she nodded. "Some for the better, others—" Well, my direction was clear. "I heard about the work you're doing," I said, "with psychologists, researchers. They say you've helped save lives." "Not enough," she replied, her gaze lowering. "Never enough to compensate for those I took." She stopped, taking labored breaths. Cancer was stealing even that from her, the very air. "I'm not here for forgiveness, Dorothy," she continued when she managed to catch her breath. "I know some things go beyond forgiveness. I'm here to tell you something I learned in these years of therapy, reflection, confrontation with the monster I had become." I looked at her, waiting. "Untreated pain doesn't disappear," she said slowly. "It transforms. Into anger, into obsessive control, into addiction, into violence. In my case, it transformed into a perverse desire for power over others' lives, but the pain itself, the original one, had never been addressed. It was still there, buried under all those destructive behaviors. She paused, gathering strength. Dr. Wilson helped me return to that original pain, to look it in the face, finally. The pain of an abused child, the pain of a woman controlled and manipulated. Not to justify, nothing could justify what I did, but to understand. And maybe to prevent others from following the same path. I took her hand, thin and fragile as tissue paper. I didn't know what to say, but I wanted her to feel she wasn't alone, not in that moment. I wrote a book, she continued. Dr. Wilson helped me. It's called From the Abyss. It tells everything, Dorothy. My childhood, the marriage with Richard, peaceful haven, without filters, without excuses, but also the after. The journey of understanding, of responsibility. It won't be published until I'm gone. But I'd like you to have a copy now. She weakly indicated a package on the nightstand. I took it, feeling the weight of the manuscript in my hands. Why are you giving it to me? Because you're the only one who knew all versions of me, Dorothy. The scared child, the teenager trying to control herself, the trapped woman, the monster. And now, whatever I've become in these years. If there's anyone who can understand the complete journey, it's you. I nodded, clutching the manuscript to my chest. And there's another reason, she added, a slight tremor in her voice. The proceeds, I want them to go to the victims' families and to your association. I know it will never compensate for what I did, but maybe it can help someone else. Tears filled my eyes. They weren't tears of forgiveness, as Margaret herself had said. Some things go beyond forgiveness, but of recognition. Recognition that even in the deepest abyss, a glimmer of humanity can survive. I'll do it, I promised. We remained silent for a while, holding hands like we did as children under the old oak tree. There was nothing more to say, yet I felt an understanding flowing between us that words couldn't have expressed. When I got up to leave, Margaret stopped me with a light touch. One last thing, Dorothy. When it's over, could you plant a tree for me? An oak, like the one under which we sat as children. Not to commemorate me, I don't deserve commemorations, but to remember that child I was before everything went wrong. To remember that in each of us there's light and darkness, and that the line between the two is thinner than we believe. I will, I promised again, my voice broken by emotion. Margaret died 3 weeks after that visit. Her funeral was a simple ceremony, almost secret. Only me, the prison chaplain, and Dr. Wilson. As she had asked, no headstone, no commemoration, only an oak planted in a small park near my house. Margaret's book was published 6 months later. From the Abyss, Memoirs of an Angel of Death became a literary phenomenon. Raw, honest, devastating in its analysis of the mechanisms that can transform a victim into an executioner. The proceeds, as promised, went to the victims' families and our association. With those funds, we managed to create a training center for healthcare operators, focused on early recognition of signs of abuse and prevention. Today, 15 years later, as I sit under the oak that has now grown strong and lush, I reflect on everything that happened, on how untreated pain can become a monster, on how understanding, even if late, can at least prevent that monster from continuing to claim victims. I never forgave Margaret for what she did. I don't think it's my right to do so. Only the victims and their families could, and many have understandably chosen not to. But I learned to separate the act from the human being, to see Margaret not as a one-dimensional monster, but as a complex being, product of trauma, wrong choices, and missed opportunities for intervention. And in this, perhaps, lies the most important lesson of this entire tragedy. That we must learn to see the signs of pain in others before it transforms into something uncontrollable. That we must create a society where asking for help isn't seen as weakness, but as strength. That we must protect the most vulnerable, the abused children who could become damaged adults, the isolated elderly who could become invisible victims. The oak continues to grow, its roots sinking deep into the ground, its branches reaching toward the sky. A symbol of how even from the deepest pain something can be born that offers shelter, nourishment, hope. And as the sun sets on this day, on this story, on this life that's now approaching its end for me too, I feel a strange peace. Not the peace of forgiveness or reconciliation. Some wounds are too deep to heal completely, but the peace of understanding, of having looked into the abyss and having found even there a glimmer of humanity. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.